So Jimmy just cuts the butt section off the rod, cuts a little bit of the tip off and sticks it into the butt section and then tapes it up. And they start casting this rod. And they were like, wow, this works. So several, and then eventually it broke. So they ended up producing some prototypes. And
That was Joseph Rosano talking about the beginning of the modern-day Northwest Spey Rod Revolution. This is the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show today. I'm excited to share a second podcast we're launching that should be a huge help if you have an outdoor business and want to improve your online presence. Head over to outdoorsonline.co and listen to the new show right now. It's live and rocking and rolling. And even if you don't have a business, just plug in this week for the big week. It'd be awesome if you could just go over there and click listen for a couple minutes. Thank you very much in advance. Joseph Rosano has been part of the development of steelhead fly fishing and tying in the Northwest since 1987. Find out how Joseph was able to connect to some of the great names around like Sid Glasso, Alec Jackson, Harry Lemire, and find out why he waited until his 50s to start writing about all of his great experiences. We begin it all today, so very happy that I could share this one with you. So without further ado, here's Joseph Rossano. How's it going, Joseph?
I'm good. How are you, Dave?
Good. I'm excited to jump into this. We were just chatting off air a little bit about some of the past episodes we've had where we've talked about some of the Northwest Spey history, and George Cook was on recently and chatting about that. So we're going to dig into a little more, but more on the fly tying side of it and steelhead flies, I guess. But before we jump into all that, can you just talk about how you first got into fly fishing and how you kind of came to become a writing about fly fishing?
Oh my God. So I kind of have to smile when you ask me that question. So anyhow, I grew up, on Long Island, and we had short-tail relatives that lived up in the Catskills, and I used to go and spend, a lot of time on the weekends and the summers in the Catskills, and eventually, my parents retired to the Catskills.
Well, when did you move out? So when was the move out west?
So, the first time I really went steelhead fishing was that summer, and I fished on the North Fork of the Stillaguamish. And interestingly enough, I was sent to what is, a very well-known piece of water called Fortson Hole. And I arrived at Fortson, and the first angler I met was Charlie Gerhart. And, Deck talks about Charlie in his books and how Charlie was a big influence. And, I still talk to Charlie to this day. He's a great guy, and one of the many mentors I ran into over the years of, being here. So, yeah, that's how that all that happened.
What year was that when you ran into Charlie?
That was 1987. That was September, late August, early September 1987. Charlie was fishing, a black grub of some type. And I remember him standing there at the top of the pool and telling me, where the fish held and how to cast to them. And I'm getting a smile on my face thinking about it now because, I haven't thought about it in ages, but that was my first day steelhead fishing. And I was fortunate to run into the right kind of guy the first day.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. And what fly were you using that day? Do you remember?
I was using a Thunder and Lightning.
Yep. Thunder and Lightning. What is a Thunder and Lightning? Describe that fly.
Well, I was using a hair-wing version of a Thunder and Lightning. I think I was like a lot of post-adolescent New Yorkers who wanted to be Atlantic salmon fishermen, and we were heavily influenced at the time by Lee Wolf. And so the fly was a reduced version of what I would end up getting involved in later. But I think it still had a silver tip and golden yellow tag with golden pheasant crest for the tail, and then black floss half of the way, and then black fur the other half of the way, with an orange hackle up the body, and then a throat of, it's supposed to be blue jay, but in this instance, I know I was using dyed blue guinea fowl with, instead of bronze mallard, it was fox squirrel wing, brown squirrel wing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I was hoping we could dig into a little bit. I mean, you're right in that era, where there's a transition coming up in the late 80s
Right.
and stuff. But can you describe? I mean, you've written some about that. Can you talk about maybe just take us back? I don't know if you want to think about the recent article you wrote, or if you just want to start off at the start and tell us some history about how steelhead fly design, kind of where it came from and how it changed, and then how that took us to where we are today.
Well, my perception of steelhead fly design is shaped by, the things that have come into my life and the people that I've spoken to about it. And, I think that every one of us who was, trying to become a steelhead fisherman, and that means, you could go out and be a steelhead fisherman, but to try to actually, successfully catch a fish, I think the first thing that any of us were introduced to was Trey Comb's first book. And I think that was 1977.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, in that book, there is extensive information about flies, the individual histories of those flies, and most of what I understand about a lot of early steelhead flies comes from that book. I was also very fortunate, like as you said, that I was here during the transition. A lot of these, let's say, pioneers of our sport were still alive, and I was, again, just, I don't know. I was in a situation where I worked in an art studio with a lot of celebrity around me. And while I was and remained somewhat reclusive and, I don't know, maybe even timid in approaching people, I was never really afraid to ask questions. I learned how to ask questions. So I was very comfortable going up to these legends and asking them questions. Very early after I moved here, I started working at Patrick's Fly Shop, and Patrick's Fly Shop is the oldest fly shop, I believe, north of San Francisco on the West Coast.
Wow.
And, so I had guys like Bob Strobel coming in and having lunch with me on Friday afternoon. And I ran into, goodness gracious, all sorts of people. Ralph Wall, Dick Vandermark, Harry Lemire, Jack DeYoung, and then people who I wasn't even aware of, Cliff Barker. And at the same time, Jim Lemire, who ran the shop, was a member of the Washington Fly Club, and he and Bob Graham asked me if I wanted to join. So I said, sure, I wanted to learn how to catch fish. And, that was at a time when a lot of information was transmitted through clubs in this way. So I joined, and I met Ralph Wall, and I met some other old time, Northwest Washington steelhead fishermen. In particular, Frank Hedrick, who I think was the inventor of the Hellcat and some of the Stillaguamish patterns. And over the years, I've fortunately developed friendships with, Ken McLeod Jr. and all sorts of, Northwest luminaries. And I get a big smile on my face when I see them. And all of our, the vast majority of these friendships are sort of based out of a translation of an oral history. And so when I think about fly patterns, to get back to your original question, and I think about the history, it's shaped by what I've read in the few books that exist about steelhead fly fishing. And I think, Van Fleet, Steelhead on a Fly,
Mm-hmm.
was a great resource. Trey Comb's second book, Trey Comb's first book are great resources.
Yeah. So you had all these people, and this is in the late '80s when you're running and
Mhm.
you're working at Patrick's Fly Shop, and you're connecting. So when did you start? So you got all this oral history from these people you're developing. When did you write your first fly fishing article or anything in fly fishing?
So, the first article I ever wrote that was published was, so I was, the other guy that I didn't mention was Alec Jackson.
Yeah.
And, Alec is one of my closest friends. And Alec, so to answer your question, I'm an artist. I have a degree in art. I've worked for a number of different people. I have and run their studios, and I have my own art career, and I show things around the world. And I had this very traditional perspective about understanding your craft, and you have to learn certain things before you go on to make your own work, and that's a very traditional perspective. And in the '80s, a lot of that convention was being challenged in the art world. Well, it was also being challenged in the real world, right? You can have a basic understanding and go off and create your own thing. And what was happening here at the same time is, as I was working at Patrick's, the Northwest Atlantic Salmon Fly Guild was starting, and there were people in there that were challenging that. So I felt, that I was around all of these people that had so much knowledge that I didn't have enough to actually say anything. And I figured, well, after I've been doing this for 30 or 40 years, maybe I'll, start writing some things, because I will have enough to say about, real experience that'll be worth listening to. And so my first article was something I wrote about 3 or 4 years ago about Alec's passing. And that was the first thing I'd written that was published. I was the editor of, the co-editor with John Olivras and Alec Jackson of the Washington Steelhead Fly Fishers newsletter. And we, published, numerous things that went with, to that group of people. This is the first time I've done that.
And what was the Alec Jackson, where was that published?
And that was in Fly Tyers Journal. Yeah. Fly Tyer and Fly Fishing Journal.
Or Fly Fishing and Fly Tying Journal. Or FTJ.
Yeah, FTJ.
Craig, who I've been working with a little bit. Yeah. So that's cool. So, and then it takes us to, I think, in the article, can you talk about some of the other ones that you've written for them? You've written a few over the last few years?
Yeah, I've written a number of things for them. I wrote this large piece about the Skagit. I wrote a piece about this project that I'm doing called School, which is a project to create awareness about salmon and steelhead disappearing across the globe. And it's an international crowdsourced art piece. And, you can find out, I think you can go to www.thesalmonschool to find out more about that and how to be involved. So I wrote a piece about that. And then I've written, I just recently wrote a piece for Swing the Fly magazine.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. And I have another piece coming out for them.
Oh, cool.
I have another piece that I'm working on about, 3 great fly tyers, Deck Hogan, Marty Howard, and Greg Hunt. And then that'll be out in the summer issue of FTJ. And then I have a piece that I'm doing about Mark Aroner and Jonas Clark, his son, which is the Spinoza Rod Company, and that'll be coming out in Swing the Fly sometime later in the year. And then I have some other things that I'm working on. I'm working on a photo essay for the Fly Fish Journal. And that, the release date of that is probably a year and a half off, because it's an exhaustive project
This is cool.
This is cool. Book associated with it. Yeah.
And this has all started in the last, basically, you said 3 years, right? This is when you first got your first thing published. I mean, It's pretty cool to hear. What stirred you 3 years ago to, and now it sounds like you're super active. You get something out there. Why are you digging into this? I'm not sure of your age, but seems like
I'm 50. Yeah. So I'm 57,
Uh-huh.
and why the reason I'm doing this is because I've been encouraged by friends of mine who have been around me the entire time, listen to me talk about, fishing and fish and, the resource. And I've just, my entire career, I've been encouraged, at some point, Joe, you need to write about this stuff. And I would say that, I really have to attribute this to, as an artist, I make things and they go out into the world all the time. It's basically like writing an article. I've had several books written about my work. I've written things that are in those books, but I never wrote anything about fly fishing. And I realized that a few years ago, we were getting ready to open the Skagit again. And much of my experience as an angler is connected to Northwest Washington, Sauk, Skagit, Stillaguamish. And, in the early days, the development of what was going on and what has become so commonplace in steelhead fly fishing was happening within a group of young guys of which I was a part. And I never became involved in the industry. I was sort of maybe on the historical or literary side, standing by and watching, and at some point I just decided, well, I'm not going to be here forever. And I have some interesting things to say. And I started to show them to Deck and to Topher Brown. And they said, yeah, you should definitely talk to a few other people. And then and Craig contacted me and said, would you, let me publish this, do a little editing to it? And I said, sure. And then once I did that, I was like, well, okay, let me see if he'd be interested in other things. And he was. And he's been a great mentor, and so has Deck. Deck has edited some of the things. He's given me time that I'm truly grateful for, and so and as has Topher Brown. So that's sort of how my life has gone too. Is I've asked these people, and regardless of what aspect it is of fly fishing or art making, and I get a response that leads to, these sorts of things.
That's awesome. Yeah. Craig has been, I haven't worked with him for a long time, but yeah, I could see the mentorship. He's definitely a good guy to talk to. And I think he's good at his craft, as the editor there. It seems like he's doing a really good job. And this is how we connected, right? I mean, I saw you and we were chatting. I've been chatting with him about stuff, and he said, you should talk to Joseph. And yeah, you're right in the wheelhouse with, obviously with the Wet Fly Swing podcast, we've covered all sorts of topics, not just steelhead, but there are a lot of steelheaders that listen to this show. And so I do want to get back to the history. Can you break down maybe just, I don't know, wherever you want to start, go back wherever in history. I mean, I guess for me, I think of, I think of my start as 80s, right? And I remember that period, the early 80s. It was hair wings, and it was, it was swinging flies on, and really all this other stuff that happened in the 90s and later was such a big shift. But yeah, start wherever you want to start back in the past and then bring us up to today.
So I graduated from college, and I was getting ready to drive. I was driving from Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
What was that? Was that 80? Was that like 1980?
That was 1987. So I was driving from Baton Rouge, Louisiana to Stanwood, Washington, which is, equidistant between, where I was going in Stanwood, Washington is on the crests between the Skagit River and the Stillaguamish.
What kind of car were you driving?
I was driving a 1984 Volkswagen Rabbit Wolfsburg edition.
Wow, you had almost a brand new car. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I had made money the previous few summers, and I purchased the car brand new for $6,400.
Amazing. How long did you have that thing?
Oh God, I think I gave it away to someone that was helping us at the house, in 1998, 99.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but anyhow, we're getting, I will try not to get sidetracked, but yeah. So I was driving out here at the time, and I stopped at my then girlfriend's house in Greeley, Colorado, and I had a copy of Kaufman Streamborn. And a lot of the fly tying I did, at the time was I would just open up the magazine and or the catalog, and I'd figure out what materials they were using, and then I would just tie the flies. So I knew I was going to steelhead country. I'd had some Atlantic salmon experience, and I decided, well, I'll tie some of these flies, and I did. Tied them. Actually, I remember tying all those chenille bodies with wool at the time, and they were all, your traditional flies like Sky Comber Sunrise and Sky Comber Sunset. If you have 15, historic steelhead flies, wet flies, high wing flies made with, either goat or bucktail or calf hair, that's what I tied. And I came out here and I went to school and I fished and then was hired. And then winter came, and I found out that's when people were doing even more steelhead fishing locally. And I was not prepared to stand in that cold water with my flyweight waders, the stuff I would have worn fishing in the Catskills or fishing in Montana. And at the same time, Jim Lemire was dating the manager of the artist that I was working for. And he says, Joe, why don't you come down and work with me on Friday? Because I know you have Friday off or Saturday. He goes, I need a break. So I came down to the shop, and this was in, let's say, March 1988. And I started working at Jim's 1 day a week, and then eventually 2 days a week. And then I was asked, if I would be interested in attending a meeting of this new group that was forming. It was called the Atlantic Salmon Fly Dressers Guild. And I said, sure. So I showed up. I can't remember where they were meeting, somewhere, the Ashford Center or something like that in Bellevue. And again, this is spring of 1988. And at the same time, I'm in these meetings, this guy was coming in and having lunch with me on Fridays, and I would, tie flies, and he would talk to me about steelhead fishing, and all I knew is his name was Bob. I didn't know anything about him. Jimmy walks in one day and he just stops talking. He says, "Hi, Bob." He stops talking. Bob's telling me about how to fish, all of this stuff about steelhead fishing. And so Bob gets up and leaves. He goes, "Oh, well, I'll see you in 2 weeks," because he did a rotation through places that he was inspecting. But it was Bob Strobel, who was a, famous Skagit steelhead fisherman. He started the Washington Steelhead Fly Fishers, which, included Harry Lemire and Bob Strobel. Harry Lemire and Sid Glasso and Wes Drain, and the luminaries go on. And so I'm getting this tutorial from Bob about how to think about flies. He was talking to me about motion. He was talking to me about how the fly wanted to fish. And then I went to the guild meeting, and Wes Drain was there, and Pat Crane was there, and some of these great Northwest steelhead fly tyers were there. And Steve Gobin was there. And, a guy that probably gets forgotten in a lot of this is Kevin Perkins, who is maybe one of the most influential fly tyers and creative fly tyers at the time. And he was there. And that was it. These guys took me under their wing. I speak to Steve weekly. He's one of my closest friends. And, so Greg Hunt was there, and we've maintained a 30-year friendship. And the interesting thing is, it was really about art, in the sense that how do you take the materials, how do you take the history of steelhead fly tying and the history of Atlantic salmon fly tying and meld them into something that is new and unique and productive.
Is it the Northwest Atlantic Fly Guild, or what was the title?
It was It was the Northwest Atlantic Salmon Fly Dressers Guild,
Dressers Guild.
and
So, yeah.
and then we formalized it late in 1989 and made it the Northwest Atlantic Salmon Fly Guild. Well, if you look in Ken Helby's book, which is an Amato publication, and I think that's 94. It came out in 94. There are flies in there by me, by Greg Hunt, by Steve Gobin, by a number of guild members. And things that came out of that and then being connected to what was happening on the Skagit, for me, were flies like the Dependable. And, you every once in a while you see that fly referenced, or you see it in other books. And the idea was, while Sid Glasso was out on the peninsula developing flies that, he felt confident in, and, this part of the conversation I can only go forward by saying, to me, the most important fly is a fly called confidence. It doesn't really matter what it is, and that's what denotes an individual fly tyer style, those things that make him confident. So, you see people who tend to like their throats heavier, or they tend to like their wings heavier, or they tend to like their bodies tapered. And you open up their fly box and you see this played out, in all of their flies. It becomes this thing that's consistent in their aesthetic. It also informs, to a certain extent, the kind of water they like to fish, right? Because the bushier flies maybe are more successful in faster water where they keep their shape, things like that. So what was happening at the meeting was what was happening at the guild was there was a transition from traditional hair-wing flies and a desire, hair-wing steelhead flyers, coupled with a desire to learn how to tie beautiful Atlantic salmon flies, presentation quality Atlantic salmon flies. And the natural step in all of this is, okay, if all you're doing is tying a classic salmon fly to go on the wall, it's going to look stagnant. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to fish it. Well, the great thing was, Greg Hunt, who's an incredible Atlantic salmon fly tyer, Steve Gobin, incredible Atlantic salmon fly tyer, all of these guys took them fishing. And the things that came out of the conversation, right? Well, I fished this fly, and yes, you can make the head smaller if you tie it in this way, but we're having these problems when we cast it. So what was happening was this assimilation of techniques designed to make really refined and clean, I think that's the best word I can use, salmon and steelhead salmon flies immediately translated into the things that we were using for steelhead.
And you were fishing those flies. I mean, is that those flies? Because I think back at that time, and I remember some people that were tying those Atlantic salmon flies, and remember thinking like, oh man, they're amazing, but there's no way I'm sitting down for 2 hours behind the vise to tie one fly. You know what I mean? It was like, I want to get out there and fish. So were these guys sitting down 2 hours tying this stuff and then fishing those 2-hour flies, or what was that like?
Right. So when we formalized the guild in terms of coming up with bylaws and all that stuff, it was perpetuated by the question, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to just tie Atlantic salmon flies, or are we trying to promote the tying or the elevation of flies for anadromous fish? And that was the sort of direction that we went in, this merger of the two. And, so to answer your question, a portion of the membership was absolutely tying flies that took 2 or more hours for the average person to tie.
Yeah.
But they were tying them much quicker than that. They were, not using some of the tricks in order to make sure they stayed on the hook, and then fishing those flies.
Yeah.
Steve Gobin and Greg Hunt and John Oshewski in particular, spent considerable time filling their boxes with patterns that, you'd open the box and go, oh my God. I open the box and go, oh my God. But that's the stuff they fish with. I think Greg's favorite winter fly was like a 3.0 Queen of Autumn. You can look that up.
Mm-hmm.
Or a Gordon, fully dressed, just gorgeous thing. And I've watched him catch, I'll go behind him with, a sculpin and I watch him, catch a winter run on that fly. So yeah, they were very dedicated to not just tying flies, but evolving the practice into their steelhead flies.
Gotcha. So they weren't fishing. So if you get in that time after those guys at the Atlantic Salmon Guild, out there fishing, they weren't just fishing a skycomish sunrise anymore. They were fishing these bigger, beautiful things with lots more materials, longer, kind of a lot different than, say, what you would fish in the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I started out talking about Sid Glasso is because his patterns, the Quileute and the Soul Duck and the Orange Heron, those are all derivative of traditional Spey flies. And while, and
yeah,
a certain amount of time was dedicated in our meetings to fly tying demonstrations, and each one of us who was fishing these flies would do a demonstration of the kinds of flies that we were fishing. And I was tying a lot of D flies at the time, both traditional and flies of my own construction, hence the name Dependable. Greg had a number of patterns that were in Helby's book. I mean, I could go grab the book now and tell you what they are.
What's the D? Can you explain what a D fly is and how that's different from a typical Spey fly or anything else?
Well, I can tell you based upon my recollection right now, if I were talking to some Atlantic salmon fly, devotee, I'd have to talk about it differently. But basically, it's a long-shanked fly with a sparse body made usually of, wool, pig's wool or some other type of wool, usually with a wide tinsel, often with a tail of golden pheasant breast feather, and then hackled usually from the third rib forward with heron, and then a throat of teal. And then often there were eyes on the fly, jungle cock eyes, that went down. So they went on the underside, on the hook end of the fly. And then the wings were strip wings. They were, and when I say strip wings, they were narrow strips of generally turkey in various different colors, from silver turkey to, oak turkey to, regular brown turkey. And they were the wings on a D fly, instead of flipped over like you see, with that typical classic shape, with the very end of the hackle tips going up on a perfectly tented feather wing, they were applied in the opposite direction so that these thin strips of turkey rested along the top of the body. And I think, so when you go full circle and you look at this and you think about, well, what does that fly look like when it's in the water? Well, it has a dark back and an iridescent core and then, a gray belly. To me, that looks like a minnow. So then the next evolution of, okay, this is why that fly worked, so having those sorts of conversations and then evolving the flies even further. Okay, this is a minnow pattern, how do we use these other materials to take it to the next place? And so that's
that's a little a good, and there's plenty of, I'm sure, information out there if somebody wants to dig in. What is there a good book on? Doesn't Shuey have one on Spey flies and D flies?
He does have a book on Spey flies and D flies. And I think that there is another book written by Buckland and Oglesby that shows classic flies of the era. And I think that's really important to look at because it shows what the guys were fishing with 100 years ago.
That's the interesting thing about this conversation, because for me, not being a historian, but just looking back on it, it seems like when you look at the history, we've talked a little, I had Trey Combs on way back in episode, I think number 5, right? I think we're on episode 140 right now. So that was a long time ago. But, he was there the early days and tying some of those flies, which were kind of based on some Atlantic salmon, but really kind of trouty too. So you kind of had that,
Oh yeah.
right? You had that period. So you had Trey coming in doing that, bringing all those flies together. And then that was a big period in the 70s or whatever, 60s, 70s. And then the next big period sounds like this, where you're talking about, where they were starting to get into Sid Glasso era. And then you get into this next phase of, really it goes with the Spey, right? The Spey rods are coming in, and now we've got Northwest Spey in the 90s. And then all of a sudden you get into this intruder thing. Is that kind of how you see it as far as that historical piece?
Well, so the answer is yes and no.
Yeah. What did I miss there? That 1 minute.
Well, because I was, I've been fortunate to spend a fair amount of time, on the river with Harry and Bob Strobel. And, I did, I had a long conversation with Harry shortly before he died on the phone, and we talked about a number of things. And in that conversation, he said to me that he went to England. Well, I mean, we talked about it in the past, but in that conversation, he sort of gave me dates. And he said that in 1985, the winter of 1985, he went to England with Peter McVeigh, the great rod maker from Merritt, British Columbia. And he being Peter was a chef, and he had a lodge up there at Corbett Lake and entertained people. And he and Harry were great friends. You'd see them on the Skagit often. And Harry went to, they were at some, establishment in Scotland, and they ran into this gentleman who was the owner of the lease at Carrington, which is where, Arthur Wood figured out the whole grease line thing. And Harry was saying, well, I've always had this dream to fish a Grant's vibration out on that piece of water. So he, this gentleman starts talking to Harry and Peter about the rod and the whole concept behind, the Grant rods, and that they had a regressive taper, etc. And Harry said that he and Peter, and Peter recounted the story too. I ran into Peter on the Thompson one day, and we were talking about it. And apparently they drove up to the driveway, and it had snowed that day, and they were in a rental car, and they couldn't get down to Carrington. So he didn't get the opportunity to do this. But he later saw Grant's vibration in London or something when they were getting ready to come home. And so at the annual outing for the Washington Steelhead fly fishers, Jimmy Green was there. Jimmy was a member, and Jimmy had a rod. And he being Jimmy and Bob Strobel were working on some double-handed rods to help Joanne, Bob's wife, Cass, who had hurt herself. So she needed a double-handed rod to fish. So they were playing around with this rod, and then Harry steps out to try it, and they have this conversation about this concept of a regressive taper. So Jimmy just cuts the butt section off the rod, cuts a little bit of the tip off and sticks it into the butt section, and then tapes it up, and they start casting this rod. And they were like, wow, this works. So several, and then eventually it broke. So they ended up producing some prototypes.
What year was that when he cut
Now,
it?
this, according to Harry, it was 1985. This is my understanding. It was 1985 that took place, the winter of 85. So this would have been, so if he was there in January or February, 85, 86, this probably would have been spring of 1986. And that they were, at Howard Miller Steelhead Park.
How old was Harry Lemire at that time in 85?
I think he was born in 1935.
Yeah, 35. Okay. So yeah, he was in his. So yeah, he's about you around your age, maybe a little younger than you are now.
Yeah, maybe. And so I know that when I showed up on the Skagit and I was talking to Bob in 1988, that's 3 years later. And they were doing all of the prototype work for what would become, the famous rod that changed it all, the 9140. And at the same time, there were other people in the area that were friends with Jimmy Green that were receiving prototypes. John Farrar was getting them. Jim Honeycutt was getting them. Cliff Barker was getting them.
How was that 9140 different from your Spey rods back in that they're using in Europe at the time?
Well, so.
Or wait, we don't have to dig way into all the, I'm just kind of curious, just generally.
Yeah. So the Spey rod was, you've seen this big movement in Spey rods made out of bamboo, and they're spliced, right? And they tape the splices together. So rods that were really ideally suited for Spey casting were rods that were spliced because the ferrules tended to break against whether it was Gerhart as the rod material or bamboo. So splicing was the way to go. And, the mass of the rods, the limitations of the material as you get larger and larger make the rods slower unless they're, disproportionately, large at the butt section. So, my experience, and I bought, at the time, I bought Grant's Vibrations, I bought Sharps, I bought other Gerhart rods just to test. And then I had, Harry gave me the prototypes that they had played around with, and I cast them side by side. This is 30 years ago. I don't have the prototypes, but I still have the Gerhart rods. So the main difference was the weight and the tip weight in particular. The tip weight on the graphite rods is much finer, and I think the other thing that's important to note is, the first time I saw Harry fishing a double-handed rod was probably 1988, 89, early 89, winter of, spring of 89, winter of 88, fall of 88. And they were already using shooting heads. There was no, the whole concept of the double taper was gone. And, he and Bob, and, I think if you want to talk to somebody who would know the history and the exact dates of all of this stuff, you'd need to talk to Al Burr. He knows,
okay.
he was
right.
there, and he knows it,
I'll get, I think I might've ran into Al at one of the expos. There's definitely some history. We're not going to cover every single piece, but it sounds like that's the big piece that you're covering there, is that, when you talk about fly design, really, Harry and Bob and those guys were getting those first Spey rods, which eventually that 9140 is the rod that, that Deck and everybody else, all those guys talk about, and that came into when Rio started making everything they were doing for fly lines, right? Which was, now we're into the 90s. Now we're into the 90s and fly design. When did fly design take a big turn?
But I think fly design started to take a turn when the Spey flies that Sid Glasso tied appeared in Trey Comb's book.
That's what I was going to say about Sid Glasso. He seems to be the one, if I think of one name, Harry is obviously a huge name, but when I think of flies, it's like Sid's name comes up first. What was his, how long was he tying those unique, that stuff? Was he tying that for back in the 70s and earlier, right? Didn't he? Maybe talk about Sid's history a little bit.
Well, if you're going to talk, the guy to talk to about Sid's history would be the guy who's writing the book on Sid Glasso.
Oh, that's right.
Dave
McNeese. I have actually. McNeese just called. Just called me. You called me yesterday, so I need to get back to McNeese because that's what we're talking about. Dave, I want to get him on and chat about.
Yeah, so
Sid.
I'm supposed to write a section for Dave about Sid and the Washington Steelhead fly fishers, which I promised I will do for his book. So now I'm saying it live. I have
Yeah, yeah.
to do
Well,
it.
this is awesome. The cool thing about this is that this is why I love the podcast, the conversations, because that's kind of how I've done this whole thing. I've started on one spot, and then as I talk to people, it just opens up all these other, ideas and options. And part of the documenting the history, I get into a lot of tips and tricks and things too. People love that, but I love also the history, right? That's why this episode is so powerful. And even though we're not going in deep on Sid, just touching the surface is pretty awesome.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, can you take us? I mean, if we're going to start to wrap this thing up, talk about what didn't we cover here from the perspective of a historical steelhead fly design, and what do you want to cover before we get out of here?
Well, you could just keep asking me questions.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just tons of stuff.
Were you part of? Tell me about. I mean, we've talked about. The OPST, I've got some of those folks, hopefully they'll be on soon, to talk about. I mean, there's one guy out there that's, I think, pretty much almost impossible to get on a podcast. Who's the well, I got Jerry French coming on, but who's the counterpart back in that?
Ed Ward.
Yeah. So Ed Ward's the guy who's impossible to get on a show. For some reason, but I've got Jerry French coming on. He's going to talk all about. We're going to dig into what they did in that period. But is that the next thing that you, and were you part of that at all in that period?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, there were guys who were devoted to the Skagit and devoted to figuring out how to fish the Skagit effectively. And in, I think, 1991, I became the importer for Bruce and Walker rods, and I was a horrible importer, but I sold double-handed rods here in the United States because Spey rods didn't really exist. So at the time, anything Spey was really connected to the Spey, and so I was the importer. I had rods at different stores, and they were just outcompeted by Sage and the local rod makers, and that's the way it went. But at the same time, I had a cabin on the Skagit from I guess 90 to 94, and before this whole thing blew up, Ed and I and Deck and Scott would run into each other regularly. And I was the first person to invite Ed to a Washington Steelhead fly fishing meeting, and he eventually became a member. And that's where he met Marlo Bumpus. So, I would say that we were all respected friends on the river who left each other alone. We were all young guys around the same age trying to figure it out. And, the thing that was consistent, regardless of whether it was Ed or me or Jerry, was, this desire to fish something bigger because the river was so big, and we wanted to increase the likelihood that a fish would see our offering. So you increase the size, but now you have to control it. You have to get it to the right depth. And what came out of the desire to increase the fly size and get it to ride well was the shank. And I talk about that in this article, and I talk about, that was Ed and Jerry doing that, developing that. And then, you needed to increase the diet.
In which article?
In the last winter's article about big flies on the Skagit, it's called Big Flies. And, that's all, evolved, progressed by Ed. And yeah, I mean, I guess it's the transition is like 1989 to 1990. When I first showed up, I guess about a year after I showed up, I saw Ed, instead of fishing a single-handed rod, he had a double-handed rod. He was using an Orvis double-handed rod with a 11-weight double taper and a sink tip. And one of his favorite flies was this small black nymph. And, we'd all congregate on the mixer and fish through. And invariably, Ed would go through after everybody else with one of those little black flies on his double-handed rod and catch a steelhead. And within a couple of years, the 9140 was out, and deck was going through the pool with his 9140, and I remember, it just took off from there. And so whenever, and he had a 9140, I believe, with a few other select people before it hit the market. And I don't know whether it was a few months before or a year before. And then the rods that Strobel and Lemire were using were 9140 prototypes, and they had them before that.
Gotcha.
A year or two before that.
What was that little black fly? So that wasn't an intruder.
That was not an intruder, no. And then I remember one day, and I wrote about this. Ed showed up at the cabin, and this was in this is like 94, spring of 94. And he sits down and he opens up his box and he shows me all this stuff, because we were having these conversations about, all right, what's in the river? What is it that the fish see when they're in the river that's big, that won't scare them, but elicit the strike response? So we talked about lampreys, we talked about sculpins, we talked about the big things that were in there. And then what is the carryover from the saltwater that, the fish are going to remember when they move upstream, and hence, the whole intruder concept. And, the thing that you really see with, what Jerry and Ed did was that they did take Atlantic salmon fly tying techniques and, completely reinvent their use, if that makes sense. So they would take primary or tail feathers of, and this is routine now, of Amherst pheasant, the banded white and black pheasant. Yeah. They would dye them. They would strip the feathers, and then they would, take those. So in other words, when you strip the feather, the flues of the feather remain connected to the stem, which is now split, and then you can wrap that. So now you have these flies that had bodies of SLF that were thinly dressed, but picked out. So they were super translucent. They gave a sense of mass, yet they were not heavy. And then, they had barbell eyes on the front so that they would remain, they would fish in the correct orientation. And that was it, So, while that was going on, I wrote an article for Swing the Fly, where I talk about uniform sync lines that I was playing with. So while they were doing that, I was playing with other lines, and now the whole Scandi thing has become really connected to that. But the thing that was going on was this realization that you needed to have something that was density compensated, and you needed to be able to turn over the fly. And there was a couple of ways to do it. One way was what became the most popular thing, which is using a very large belly to turn over a very short, very heavy sink tip with a weighted fly. So successively heavier material. The other way is to make your line successively heavier and the fly buoyant, so it doesn't hang up on the bottom, which is the direction I went with.
Which is more of these, I guess, I don't know if that's scam. I mean, Klaus Freemore was on, and he talked about underhand casting, and we got into some of that.
Yeah. I mean, so, you're asking me about flies, and the thing that I have to always align it to is, a lot of people tie flies because they like to tie beautiful things, right? They like to have these beautiful things in their box, and they look at them and they are seduced by what's in their box.
Yeah.
And then the fisherman, who's purely thinking about, okay, how do I trick the fish? Maybe not necessarily catch the fish, but how do I trick the fish? What do I need to do? And that sometimes informs a very different looking fly box. And I'd like to think that I've been able to be unbiased enough to see both sides of that. And because that's what so if there's anything that I've been able to write about, it's, sort of that crossover between both forms of the art, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think is, when you look back at the history of, we've been talking about steelhead fly design here. What do you think is the biggest change in that whole history? You go back to the 60s or 50s or whatever.
if I were to think about the biggest change in fly design from the 60s to the present,
Yeah.
in steelhead fishing, it has to be the intruder. It has to be, but and you can ask Jerry this, but I think the thing that's most important about the intruder is not the intruder pattern itself, but the invention of the shank that allows you to tie intruders.
Exactly.
And it's like anything else that takes a while to gain favor. When you realize that it's okay to tie a fly that's 6 inches long, and now you can tie it so that it's easy to cast and fish, and then you see that it's successful, well, then all of a sudden everybody starts to do that, right? Because they want to be successful.
If I had to go to one thing right now, or direct somebody to one thing that, that you really feel like it's something that represents what you're all about, or it doesn't have to be writing, it could be anything in your life as well.
You have to come up with an idea, and you have to realize the idea, and then you have to make it to the best of your ability, and then you have to let it go. And I have made a lot of things in my life, and once they go out the door, I don't think about them. And I know that might sound horrible, so like if it's almost like I don't even need to be paid for what I do. And that's really not true, but that's sort of how I look at it.
You mean you don't review it? You don't look what?
I do review it until it goes out. And then once it leaves, 6 years or 10 years later, I walk into somebody's home, a collector's home, and go, oh my God, I made that. And then I wake up, I'm awoken by what I've done. I'm not consciously thinking about it. So if I were to say anything that I've written in the last 3 years that's been in FTJ or Swing the Fly is very current, and of all, so it gives you a really good insight into who I am and where I'm coming from. But I would say that as somebody who spends your life as a creative, I'm constantly moving my ideas and my ability to translate them forward. So I'm always getting better at it. So what's my favorite piece will be the next one, so you should read next month's issue or 2 months issue of FTJ with the article about Dick Hogan and
oh, that's awesome.
And Marty Howard and Greg Hunt. And there'll be some of this story in there and some of how things progressed and how the Northwest Atlantic Salmon Fly Guild influenced people way outside of the Pacific Northwest. So
perfect.
So that's how I would wrap it up.
Awesome. And that's perfect, because the FTJ is actually currently a sponsor of this podcast. So I love that. We threw that out to wrap this up. Hey, so is that, if you had to say the best resource, if somebody wanted to dig more into the history of, like we've been talking here today, is that it, or is there another resource you'd send them to?
So, if you were to go to my website, there's a CV on my website, and all the publications that I've been in, films that I've been in, and things that have been written about me or whatnot, and things that I've written are there. So you can go there.
Okay, and that's
find there's bibliography there, and you can find things.
So there you go. If you want to find all the show notes, all the links we covered, just go to wetflyswing.com/136. A reminder, the new podcast is out and it's going. I'd love it if you could click over and have a listen at outdoorsonline.co. It would mean a lot to me if you could just click play and listen on your app of choice, or even at the website. Appreciate you stopping in today and helping out. I want to thank you again for coming by, and hope to maybe see you on the river or online.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.